Imagine hearing these words for the very first time. Not from a philosopher, not from a political leader, but from a Jewish rabbi speaking to people living under Roman occupation. He says, "Love your enemies." For the audience listening to Jesus Christ, those words would have sounded shocking, almost impossible, because their enemies were not theoretical. Their enemies were real. Roman soldiers who occupied their land, tax collectors who exploited their people, political powers who oppressed their nation. Yet Jesus didn't say tolerate them. He didn't say ignore them. He said love them. In this episode, we're going to explore what Jesus meant, and why this teaching was so radical, and what it means for us today. The teaching comes from the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most important teachings in the Gospels. In Gospel of Matthew 5:44, Jesus says, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." To modern ears, this may sound like spiritual poetry, but to a first-century audience, it sounded like a revolution of the heart. To understand this teaching, we must understand the world Jesus was speaking into. First-century Judea was under Roman rule. Rome controlled the land. Roman soldiers enforced their authority. Heavy taxation burdened the population, and political tension was everywhere. Many Jews longed for liberation. Some believed the Messiah would lead a political revolution against Rome. Groups like the Zealots even promoted violent resistance. So when Jesus began teaching about the kingdom of God, people expected talk of victory and conquest. Instead, Jesus said something very different. He said, "Love your enemies." Not destroy them, not retaliate against them. Love them. This teaching overturned the expectations of the crowd. Jesus begins by referencing a familiar idea. You have heard that it was said, "Love your neighbor and hate your enemy." The command to love one's neighbor was rooted in the law of Moses. But hatred toward enemies had become a cultural attitude. Many people limited their love only to those within their own group. Family, friends, community, nation. But Jesus expands the definition of love beyond tribal boundaries. He says, love must extend even to those who oppose you. The word Jesus uses for love does not primarily describe emotion. It describes action. This kind of love means choosing to seek the good of another person, even when they do not deserve it. It means refusing to respond to hatred with hatred. It means rejecting the cycle of revenge that dominates human history. This teaching challenges one of humanity's oldest instincts, retaliation. When we are hurt, we want to strike back. When we are insulted, we want to respond. When we are wronged, we want justice immediately. But Jesus introduces a new way. Jesus gives the reason for this radical teaching, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. In other words, loving enemies reflects the character of God. God shows kindness even to those who oppose him. The sun rises on both the righteous and the unrighteous. Rain falls on both the just and the unjust. God's generosity is not limited to those who deserve it. His mercy reaches even the undeserving. And Jesus calls his followers to reflect that same character. This command is difficult because it touches the deepest parts of the human heart. Loving friends is natural. Loving family is expected. But loving enemies requires transformation. It requires humility. It requires forgiveness. It requires the surrender of pride. This is why Jesus did not simply offer new moral advice. He introduced a new kind of life, the life of the kingdom of God. Loving enemies does not mean approving evil. It does not mean ignoring injustice. And it does not mean pretending wrongdoing is acceptable. Jesus himself confronted hypocrisy and injustice many times, but he refused to allow hatred to control his response. The difference is profound. Justice seeks restoration. Hatred seeks destruction. Jesus calls his followers toward restoration. The most powerful example of this teaching appears at the end of Jesus' life. As he was crucified, Jesus prayed for those responsible. "Father, forgive them." In that moment, Jesus demonstrated the very teaching he had given. Love even in the face of hatred. Mercy even in the face of violence. Grace even in the face of injustice. The teaching to love enemies is not merely a spiritual idea. It challenges the way we live every day. It affects how we respond to conflict, how we handle criticism, how we deal with people who oppose us. In a world driven by outrage and division, this teaching remains deeply countercultural. It calls believers to break the cycle of hostility, to answer hatred with grace, to respond to injury with mercy. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies," he was not offering an easy path. He was describing the character of those who belong to the kingdom of God. This teaching does not come naturally, but it reveals something profound about the heart of God. And it invites every follower of Jesus into a life that reflects that heart. A life marked not by revenge, but by love,